stay here and enslave people for that. Lunatic. Keep drinking, keep hiding. But me, I choose to run toward my problems and not away from them. That's what... Because that's what heroes do.
All right, all right. Hello, all my beautiful friends, followers, supporters, subscribers, collaborators. I'm back. Badder than ever? I don't know. I'll let you decide that. Bad could be like bad, like cool, or bad could be like trash. So anyway, I'll let you decide that. So a week ago, I posted a controversial video. Well, it was a video that contained controversial material. Controversial because of the internecine nature of certain fandoms, certain cliques within certain fandoms that engage on social media platforms. And, you know, I tried to be as sparing as possible of hurt feelings. I only wish certain parties had been sparing of mine, but you can't have everything. So unless there's some kind of recurrence of this phenomenon, I'm going to move on from that and go back to doing my thing and just, hey, Kal-El's making a cameo, trying to, you know, do my thing and air my views. And if somebody wants to come at me, whether it's real life, you know, Facebook, Messenger, YouTube, Zoom, at a convention in front of other people, bring them on. I'm a sensitive guy, so I'm sure they could say a lot of mean things that would hurt my little feelings. But I'd strike back twice as hard. That's what you learn in life, being bullied. So enough of that self-indulgent soul-bearing. What's prompted me to do this video is, well, I told you guys that I wasn't going to do any more superhero or comic book inspired movies or television until Thor: Love and Thunder. Now, the theatrical release of that movie came and went, so it gave me time to do some other stuff. And yes, I did kind of make some exceptions with Ms. Marvel because of its exceptional awfulness. And The Boys was on a good roll then too. I thought that was a good opportunity to do a comparison contrast and contextualize why I like one and don't like the other. So that's my video, The Boys versus Ms. Marvel, antitheses. I think it's a hilarious idea personally. But anyway, moving on from that, I haven't done any comic book inspired movies at all. I mean, there's bunches I like. A lot of them are not superhero films at all. A lot of them are not American films either. But I tried to steer clear and definitely have the superhero genre. So to me, the Ms. Marvel commentary is like every level of the Ms. Marvel commentary, from the premiere remarks to the Boys versus to the in defense of my opinion against someone who's really not, you know, all that keyed in to what's really going on about a lot of things, but believes they're a genius and a jester. Do all that. It really was kind of informal. So I want to do a formal review of Thor: Love and Thunder. I finally saw it last night. I saw it on Disney Plus. I had access to this channel, have had access to this channel, thanks to the good graces of permanent channel patron Tim Tolbert. Tim Tolbert! He has been a major driving, supporting, collaborating force off camera. You can almost call him kind of an invisible producer or a co-producer. I consider him a co-producer. But, you know, thank you, Tim. So he had been eager to hear what I thought about Love and Thunder. He had seen it in the theater and was kind of holding back saying much. He did give me some spoiler-laden plot points, but I'd already read them elsewhere a few weeks earlier, and I'd kind of forgotten some of them. And then I was like, "Oh, okay, this is what happens." But that didn't take this, that didn't take the pleasure out of the proceedings for me. I knew how it was going to end, but I didn't know how it's. Excuse me. That's just words, fancies in the air, as Dio said. Remember Dio, Ronnie James Dio? He plays a part in this review. As you guys know, he's my favorite all-time singer. So yeah, I mean, this movie hit me, and I'm gonna talk like the Gen Zs. This movie hit me in the feels, man. It really did. So let's get on with it. Taika Waititi is back as director and co-writer. This guy has delivered 2 films in a row about Thor, the MCU version of Thor, not strictly based strongly on the Marvel Universe version of Thor, very loosely on the legendary Norse god of thunder. So he is an iteration of Thor. So Taika decided to take a different tact with Thor Ragnarok, the previous installment, the 3rd Thor feature film. I didn't personally care that much for Thor Dark World. I thought the tone it struck was just not something that pulled me in. I know people who loved it more in the first one. The first one, Chris Hemsworth was a little awkward as an actor, especially sharing scenes with Anthony Hopkins, who looked like he just didn't want to be there. And from what I've read, he didn't. He wasn't the first choice for casting. Brian Blessed was. He was a bit older than Hopkins, not much. Of course, famous, world-renowned as Prince Voltan in the 1980 Flash Gordon film by Michael Hodge, starring Sam Jones and the wonderful Dale Arden, who I met in person. Dale Arden's the character. Melody Anderson's the actor. She is one of the sweetest celebrities, if not the sweetest I've ever met. Blessed is, he's become part of the pop culture, lexicon, memes, or whatever, with some of his sayings, especially Gordon's alive. I won't act it out. But anyway, something happened and it became Anthony Hopkins, which, is a pretty classy decision. I personally wouldn't have cast him, but if I'd had, I would have directed him a lot better than he was directed in the first 2 films. Now, Kenneth Branagh is used to this, who directed the first film. He was one of the first, if not the first, really big name quasi-auteur that Marvel hired to helm one of their productions. They only had a handful. I mean, and Favreau was a newbie. They were taking a risk on Jon Favreau with Iron Man, and luckily it paid off creatively and financially, and kind of launched this whole MCU era. The guy who did Captain America had done The Rocketeer, which different people have different feelings about. But I do think he kind of nailed it. But he wasn't a director of much heft. He was kind of like a geek fan favorite. That's not a knock, for I'm a geek too. Or The Rocketeer. Rocketeer being a very famous, well, now somewhat famous, comic book by the late Dave Stevens, which never had a very long run in its different iterations, but was well beloved for his art and his creativity. And he, of course, drew deeply from the well of pulp heroes, and it was set during the pulp era, the 1930s and 40s. And so that's kind of the same milieu, which is tapped into a lot by the Walter Newton and Philip was a Farmer fan community that I know. uh, and which I've kind of now, from the last video, without naming them, I guess you could just glean that I have removed myself, not virtually, I'm in the groups and whatever, but I'm, as far as engaging as a group, uh, that's past, that's going to be in the past. I still like people one-on-one. One in particular who was the the figurehead, the driving force, Scott Eckert of the whole scene. He was a huge Rocketeer fan, and Rocketeer had a lot of crossovers, some subtle. Betty Page obviously was a character, which, I mean, fictionalized Betty Page. Doc Savage was alluded to, the Shadow, and so on. And so it became a favorite of the Walden Newton crew, and the crossover aspects of Walden Newtonry, which eventually became, a massive 2-volume book set by Wynne called Crossovers. Is it A Secret History of the World? See, I get the all subtitle mixed up. I was corrected by my friend Sean Lee Levin. Sean Lee Levin wrote 2 sequels, Crossovers Expanded, and word is he's hammering away at a third, which will be the 5th in total. So Rocketeer fits right into that kind of fandom, that kind of fascination with fictional crossovers, especially of pulp heroes and action, science fiction, mystery characters. But I'm not here to talk about that. I talked about that scene quite enough in the last video, albeit in maybe not the most positive of fashions. So what I was attempting to say is that the guy who did the Rocketeer did Captain America, did a good job, but again, he wasn't a real strong auteur. So Marvel got Kenneth Branagh, and I guess that's almost stunt casting as a director. Branagh directed it not in a particularly visionary or individualistic fashion. Marvel hadn't quite codified their style, overall their vibe, but they were already laying the groundwork for that. Thor was not an exception. The most egregious things in Thor, the first film, Thor 2011, that I found that were harbingers of things that I personally didn't care for in the MCU, and which were kind of quirks, that they were affectations of the plot that they were enchanted with, mainly Agent Coulson and their bizarre depiction of S.H.I.E.L.D. as an organization. Clark Gregg, to me, is just kind of a blah actor. He's not untalented, but he's a blah actor. And I don't like the character Coulson. I think you were meant to not like him at first. He represented a bureaucracy, a bureaucratic, CIA-like figure. And the character Jane Foster, played by Natalie Portman, along with her buddy Darcy, they were kind of the irreverent characters, like basically telling Coulson, well, we're doing research, this is important, fuck you. In the middle of this is this cat, Thor, stripped of all his immortal powers, walking around muscle bound. Darcy's getting excited, and they call him Donald to keep him on the sly, because Donald Blake was a former lover of Jane Foster, Dr. Donald Blake. So it was funny when Coulson called him Donald. Now we know, a lot of us know in the comic books, for years Thor had a thing where he could stamp his hammer and turn into a walking cane, and he was a lame. I don't mean lame like, he's less lame, fuck that. I mean lame as in handicapped, handicapable, doctor, and he had a totally different personality from Thor. And I was always fascinated by the whole dichotomy, how it happened. And when Kirby and Lee finally settled on an origin for Donald Blake, it was basically that Odin had created Donald Blake out of his imagination. We later learned he had based him on a guy named Dr. Kincaid, that Jane Foster had kind of a thing with. And just altered his appearance a little and just kind of let him develop his own personality. So the first Thor movie smushed together all these ideas, but very much on the down low, almost as Easter eggs or fan service to cats like me who grew up with the Mighty Thor comic books and know all this minutia. So it's kind of funny, but the Coulson stuff wasn't funny, but it was attempting to be kind of funny. MCU's version of S.H.I.E.L.D., original take on S.H.I.E.L.D., never sat well with me. Now, when we learned that it was really Hydra all along and most of the agents are corrupted, and then we see flashbacks of the good agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the earlier days working, with people like Henry Pym and, of course, Fury and others. That was interesting. Howard Stark, and of course, in the Agent Carter TV show, which I'm pretty certain is still MCU canon. That was interesting. And having Peggy Carter be the founder of S.H.I.E.L.D. and be a woman, not even an American woman in the early 50s was a cool idea, even though I never watched Agent Carter. I read a lot about it. So you guys who were fans can tell me if I'm off base, but I'm pretty sure it was laying the groundwork for S.H.I.E.L.D. with her and Howard Stark. And, her and Howard Stark. And some other characters who my brain's not clicking on. So, the first Thor movie, what I liked about it was while he was stranded on Earth, stripped of his powers to learn humility, which they combined, like I said, they combined a few of the Don Blake things. They combined a bunch of different things from a bunch of different comic books. Thor had been stripped of his powers by an angry Odin numerous times. And, so this was kind of, you're thinking we later find out Thor is over 1,500 years old. So did Odin just let Thor run rampant as a arrogant jackass for that long? And then finally in the 21st century, he's like, I'm going to teach you humility. Because it was basically on the eve of Odin abdicating, and Thor's going to wear the big wooden helmet he wore in the comics. He was going to become, Prince Thor and be on the throne and ultimately king. But his own actions, slightly manipulated by Loki, his adopted brother. We all know about Loki, played by James Hiddleston. Kind of fucked things up. But they brought in a great Kirby design and character, an iconic one, the Destroyer. And Thor stood up to him as a mortal while the Destroyer's killing the town. And that was great. I thought that was very good. Hemsworth did good, and of course Portman, her support of the scene sells it really. And it was a bit violent because, the Destroyer hitting Thor, he was going to die. I mean, Destroyer swatting Thor with no powers, a mortal Thor, he probably broke half the bones in his body. But then Mjolnir came back to him, and he was worthy again. So that's where we begin the story of the superhero Thor, member of the Avengers, and adventures on Earth, and of course a romance with Jane Foster. The Thor-Jane Foster romance is central to the mythos of the Marvel Universe, the comic book Marvel Universe history. It's really, in the early years, it was a driving factor for the character. So Don Blake has a nurse, Jane Foster. He can't ever tell her he loves her. Stan Lee did this shit a lot back in the soap opera dialogue, where, I can't tell her because if she knows my secret identity, my enemies will kill her. Spider-Man, Daredevil, they all kind of lamented over this problem. And of course, Thor doesn't have a secret identity. Donald Blake was his secret identity. There was that element there. My enemies might come after Jane. And of course, they always did anyway. Some, you know, there always be a plot contrived reason why these outlandish villains like Mr. Hyde and the Cobra would be, you know, have some kind of truck with Don Blake or Jane Foster or even Thor. You know, when it's like they're so beneath him power wise. But they were fun and innocent days. The comic book hadn't congealed yet. As I understand it, Larry Lieber wrote quite a bit of the stories early on. I mean, the very first story in Journey into Mystery number 83 was drawn by Jack Kirby. Though his art style was slightly different than in Fantastic Four and Hulk. I'm not sure who inked him. In some of the early issues, Joe Sinnott did early inking on Kirby, and it had more of a Joe Sinnott feel because Kirby's layouts were so loose. Now later on, they had more of an even partnership on Fantastic Four, which went on to become, you know, extremely well-regarded art team, you know, working in the Marvel Universe. But Sinnott was kind of, you know, messing around, and Larry Lieber was doing layouts too, and pencils and breakdowns, and Kirby layout, you know. As for who wrote these stories, I don't know. I think Kirby had a lot of ideas and threw them to Larry Lieber. I do think Stan Lee had some ideas and threw them at Larry Lieber, and I think Larry Lieber had a lot of ideas. To be honest, my theory is Larry Lieber became the dominant force until they started doing the backup story, Tales of Asgard. Now that was all Kirby, and of course Lee's embroiderment, and it was more a harbinger of the direction the comic book was going to go in than the mainline series. Because in the main series, he was still, you know, fighting Cobra and Mr. Hyde and the Grey Gargoyle and Hulk and Magneto and of course Loki all the time. Loki and the Executioner and the Enchantress. And of course, Loki, Executioner, and Enchantress all became important villains in the first year or two of the Avengers. But this isn't about the Avengers, so I'm not going to go into that. But what I'm driving at is Thor. No one knew Don Blake was Thor. He was, you know, he didn't even know that he wasn't a real person. Don Blake had memories. He didn't know he was a construct created by Odin, which shows you how incredibly powerful Odin was. And Odin, as you know, depicted by Jack Kirby and quite a few writers after him, he wasn't omnipotent or omniscient as he was sometimes described, but he was insanely powerful. He was a god. Come on, he was the All-Father. So, but Thor wanted to be with Jane Foster. Odin had this edict: you cannot marry a mortal. I mean, it was all very contrived but also very Shakespearean and also kind of soap opera and angst-ridden. You know, it was perfect for the 60s. And, you know, it had a lot of that Shakespearean, fanciful, you know, aspect to it, but it also had a bit of that superhero with problems angst that Stan Lee popularized. I'm not going to say created, because he co-created that trope along with Ditko and Kirby. Ditko was really, what Spider-Man really was, to me, he was the most emblematic of that concept. But Lee carried it over into the dialogue of all the books: Daredevil, Iron Man, who could die at any minute because of his heart, and even Captain America, who was like, you know, all angst-ridden over being a man out of time. And the Thing, who couldn't become human, the Hulk, we all know Hulk's problems, a lot. So, but Thor's was he couldn't hook up with Jane Foster. So they went back and forth, and finally they did this test thing where she could be a goddess or not, and she failed. Then we learned Odin had acquired a little soft spot for her, a little modicum of respect, which was not to be. Jane Foster forgot about Thor through some enchantment, and later hooked up with this Dr. Kincaid character. And she was no longer a regular character in the comic. Thor moved on and began a long romance with Sif. Because in Norse mythology, Sif and Thor were married. They had two sons, Magni and Modi. Sif was very different in Norse mythology than Marvel. In Marvel, she was a warrior woman. But that was cool. And then Thor and his buddies, Balder the Brave and Sif, would fight all these threats to the realm eternal, Asgard. And then often backed by the Warriors 3. Now, in the films, we have seen Sif, we have seen the Warriors 3. The Warriors 3 are all dead. And I guess taking Balder's place as Thor's good buddy in the movies was Heimdall. Heimdall was Sif's brother in mythology and in the comics, but not in the movies. So in the movies, Heimdall was more that role of his fellow warrior that he fought beside for, centuries. Of course, he was killed in Infinity War. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, Dark World was kind of non-committal. His mother died, Frigga, and that was the beginning of all this woe and misery of Thor. He thought Loki was dead, but Loki was alive, and then Loki became extremely evil. And then, it was captured and escaped and all this other stuff. So, and still was kind of depicted slightly as somewhat as a sympathetic character in Dark World, even after all the horrible things he did in Avengers. So there's a theory as to how all this actually makes sense about Loki's arc as a character. I could talk about this stuff all day. Maybe I will. In the Loki miniseries, there's a point where I believe Mobius says, that basically in every reality, every Loki variant is essentially destined to be redeemed, destined for redemption, rather than becoming all evil, like the comic book. And that's interesting. Another theory I've encountered, which I've adopted in my headcanon, is that the spear with the, one of the Infinity Gems on it, I forget which one, I think the Mind Gem, maybe, that he used to control people, controlled him. Thanos used it to control him. That's why Loki in the Avengers is so evil and out of character with previous and especially subsequent appearances. I totally buy that. And each Loki, the variant Loki that split off, that was defeated and the spear taken away, that version in Endgame ends up in the Loki series, and that's now our main guy, Loki. That's the variant we're following, and he's not on 616, but I believe he will come to 616, the main Marvel universe. But he's in this place outside of time and space, the Time Variance Authority and their realms, which eventually lead to the Citadel at the end of time, He Who Remains, and Kang the Conqueror. Now, all of this stuff in the Loki series came from different Thor arcs, except for Kang himself. But Kang fought Thor plenty in the Avengers. But all of the things I just mentioned, the Timekeepers, which were originally the Time Twisters, all of this comes from the Thor comic books. And they kind of mashed it all together. I mean, they had mashed some of that time stuff together in more recent comics. But they did a great job. It was interesting, that the concepts are not other Marvel concepts. They're just throwing into Loki. But they're stuff that originated with Thor, even if they're not easily associated with the character of Thor, especially the movie Thor. So that's Loki. And then, of course, the Loki that redeemed himself in Thor Ragnarok dies in Infinity War. And another blow to Thor after he's lost his father, fought and lost his sister Hela, lost the Warriors 3. Sif's been way off the radar for a while. which I was like, are they going to bring Sif back for Love and Thunder? And they did, but I think they could have done more with her. But what they did was fine. Thor lost his eye, which he later had a substitute eye given to him by Rocket Raccoon, who became one of his best friends. And unlikely as that seems, it's cool. It makes sense to me. And again, there's some root in the comic books. Steve Gerber's Thor annual, I forget which number, I guess the early 80s, where Korvac first appeared. It became a very powerful foe of the Avengers. And managed to kill all the Avengers except for Thor and Moondragon. He couldn't kill a real god. The Moondragon was a poser, pretending to be a goddess. The Korvac first appeared in that annual, and it was basically Thor time traveling to the era of the Guardians of the Galaxy and battling Korvac. And of course, Korvac then basically kind of, not directly, but kind of follows Thor to the 20th century and sucks a bunch of energy from the Galactus's home ship and himself becomes a god. And I'm going to pause briefly, and then I'm going to continue down this road until I get to Thor Love and Thunder, and then I'll probably make a second video. So hold on. So yeah, this is another one of these magnum opuses, and I guess I should have expected it would turn out that way. I couldn't jump into Thor because I feel like I can't really express why I hold the opinions I do, which run counter to so many fans, without explaining the context, which is that I grew up with those comic books, and that I also am an extreme aficionado of the MCU, even though I don't like all of their work. I don't know if I should say that out loud. So, yeah, I'm trying to give you guys some context and the previous movies. The arc of Thor, the arc of the MCU Thor played by Chris Hemsworth, I think it was going into a dull area with Dark World. And Natalie Portman lost interest and quit and said she wasn't going to do anymore. So when we finally see Thor solo again in Ragnarok, we find out that, in these years in between, that they've been broken up a while. That she dumped Thor. And Thor, it's a source of embarrassment for Thor, and I guess it's supposedly humor for the audience. This was Thor Ragnarok, the third film. The third Thor solo film, directed and written by Taika Waititi, his first adventure into being a Marvel Studios creator. And he really redefined things. He was a game changer. There's so many classic and brilliant and beautiful touches to Ragnarok. It blew me away. I mean, yes, it did turn a lot of the material into comedy. Not going to deny that. I enjoyed the way it was done. A lot of people hated it. But the thing is, if I hate it, that means I really have to hate the basic nature of Hemsworth's Thor, dating back to the first movie, really. Because his personality was a bit more like Hercules' in the comics than it was Thor's. Thor did, speak big and brag and, invoke a lot of dramatic things, but I mean, he didn't act like kind of like a Point Break or long-haired surfer guy like Tony Stark characterized him as in the movies. But he was melodramatic. But he was a bit more grave and serious. Maybe he took himself too serious. There are elements, of course, of the comic book Thor in the MCU Thor, but the MCU Thor was nonetheless a departure to an extent personality-wise from the very beginning. He was a more lighthearted character, a more irresponsible character, and even though he had a dramatic arc that I mentioned earlier that paid off when he regained his hammer, Dark World, I think, was that a dark world. I think it was kind of a flat, kind of dull movie, maybe Gray World, you know. Um, I don't think it was a failure, but it certainly was not any kind of success. But it did begin some key ideas, which remain, well, really, that Loki could possibly once again be sympathetic, and that Frigga, Thor's mother, was now deceased, and thus begins him losing everyone and everything important in his life. And how does he rebuild? How does he go forward? And that's really the arc that Waititi started, and it ran through Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and now into Thor Love and Thunder. And it's been a glorious arc. So that's what we're starting out with, is Thor post Thor Ragnarok, in which Ragnarok happened. It occurred. Asgard was destroyed, and the survivors of Asgard became refugees on a starship and eventually came to Earth after much struggle, because in the way they were attacked by Thanos, and several of them, including Loki and Heimdall, were killed. The beginning of Infinity War, the opening scene, is about this. And it really turns Ragnarok on its head. Because Ragnarok has a lot of dark, bad, sad, depressing shit in it, but it also has this humor, this wit, this energy. The energy is infectious. And it also has a style that stands out really against all of the other Marvel Cinematic Universe films. Because A, it's a style of its own. There's not a sameness like there was in Dark World or the first Thor movie. The first Thor movie scaled down Kirby's concepts and Walt Simonson's concepts to a more, user-friendly level, I think. But people like me who had already experienced it were overjoyed that Waititi's like, no, man, this is the world of Thor. And rendered it visually, rendered it cinematically. And you connect with these characters on a human level, even though they're gods, most of them, through that humor and that affection, that camaraderie that exists between Thor and Hulk, between Thor and Loki, between Valkyrie and Hulk, Thor and Heimdall. I mean, there's a lot of joy amidst all the sorrow, and that's the characterization part. And then the rest is the spectacle. And Thor did start speaking more melodramatically. A lot of his over-the-top humorously delivered, pompous, declarations were straight from the comic books. So, because how can you take some of that stuff seriously now? I mean, Kirby wrote these characters that way, obviously, because you see it in later Kirby solo stuff like New Gods and the Eternals, especially. Yet, there was a levity in the Eternals that's not in Stan Lee's dialogue for Thor. That I wonder, what if Kirby had written Thor, scripted it? Now, he did script the comics. He wrote, basic word balloons. Sometimes he got, it's very basic. Thor does such and such, or Thor's like, I'm here, I'm blah, 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 But sometimes they got much more detailed. And in those cases, Stanley pretty much just verbatim took Kirby's dialogue. But he kind of added to it. And in the case of Thor, like in other comics where he did it, like, over other people's penciled in dialogue, like Ditko's Spider-Man, Kirby's Fantastic Four, he went kind of way overboard on Thor, and that was his kick. Just as he kind of went way overboard on Ditko's Doctor Strange. But he was he yielded to Ditko, and ultimately when Ditko was gone, he did get more melodramatic. And then when Roy Thomas replaced him, Roy Thomas got way, way melodramatic over the top. But Thor was reading some of the stuff now, man. It's like they could have shorn it of quite a few word balloons and just let the pictures speak for themselves. So to me, Waititi is like taking all that shit and he's putting it like some kind of fucking cosmic Cuisinart, and out comes Ragnarok. And some could argue that means out comes a lump of shit. But no, I think he transformed not shit, the base material into pure gold. The prima materia has to go through the stages of alchemy to achieve a magnum opus. I would argue that Waititi's work on Thor is alchemical art at its finest. You can dismiss that, but then if you pull in Waititi's other ideas, like What We Do in the Shadows, and the strangeness of that, and the intuitive nature of its writing, using genre tropes, but in a fresh way, taking it as far as he can get away with. You could even argue it in that Hitler movie he made. I forgot the name of it. I have very mixed feelings about that film. But it was big. It was Oscar nominated, and it's kind of considered by a lot of people to be his only serious movie. Like, why is he doing this fucking Love and Thunder? Get back to the serious shit. I don't know. To me, What We Do in the Shadows and that movie I can't remember the name of, everyone's going to laugh at me because I can't remember the name of this film. I call it Little Hitler in my head. I know that's not the name of it. It has these weird elements of the tin drum in it. And Come and See, but it's not dark like them. It's ridiculous. You're supposed to sympathize with this little boy who loves Hitler. And somehow Waititi made it palatable during an era where, the media was throwing around the term Nazi and Hitler like they were going out of circulation to describe MAGA and Trumpsters and all this other shit. And maybe that's what made the movie work. Maybe Waititi's playing against that, the sheer outrageousness of this kid worshiping Hitler. At one time, that kind of movie would have not been shocking at all. That would have been like a 1970s New Hollywood film, and it would have just been a quirky film by fill in the blank, auteur of the time. In the 2010s, though, that's a risky calculation to make. And he pulled it off critically and commercially. Me personally, I'm not a fan. I'm not a detractor. I watched it twice. It wasn't review worthy to me. It was interesting talking to other people from across the spectrum of knowledge of film and knowledge of World War II and knowledge of Taika Waititi, expressing all these different kinds of opinions about it. But it seemed the consensus was, okay, now he's arrived, he's a genius. And then there's What We Do in the Shadows TV series that he kind of works on. I don't think he does all the nitty gritty on it. But, obviously that's a way of carrying forward his comedic vision. So a lot of people have no use for his Thor work. I'm coming out the other direction. I knew who he was with What We Do in the Shadows. But Ragnarok is what made me a fan of his. And I think his body of work is still small, relatively speaking. But I think within that small body of work, he's made 4 films that are very distinguished. What We Do in the Shadows, the baby Little Hitler movie. I can't remember the name of it. And yes, Thor Ragnarok, and yes, Love and Thunder. A lot of people are writing off Love and Thunder as though it's just a follow-up copycat of Ragnarok, and he's lost his edge, and he's taken the humor too far. And there were moments when I thought he began to take the humor too far. A recurring joke in Act 2 of Love and Thunder, for instance, is that Thor's kind of acting stupid and clueless. And it doesn't fit with Act 1 or Act 3 or what we've seen of Thor, even in Ragnarok, where he's really quite a trickster, almost more of a trickster than Loki. They're kind of tricksters together, like. Get help! I hate Get Help. I love it. But anyway, if you haven't seen Ragnarok, you have no clue what I'm for. But I don't know. In Act Two of Love and Thunder, he acts like he can't be a hero. He loses his mojo. I mean, he really needs Valkyrie to stand up and kind of really make the decisions, which is sensible. He made her king of New Asgard, and I like the gender bending of the fact she's a lesbian and they call her King Valkyrie. Like he made her king, like she took the position that was rightfully his. He gave it to her. But then you would figure, well, she's a woman, so she's really Queen Valkyrie, but she goes by King Valkyrie. And the male business suits, black pinstripes that she wears to the meetings with all the heads of state and all this media, that was brilliant too. I love that character. I love Tessa Thompson. She's my girl. As Tim Tolbert always says, that's your girl. She's my girl. I have loved her in quite a few works. And some things I've read about her in real life made me really respect her a lot. But my first experience with her was Ragnarok. Other people already knew who she was. Ragnarok really affected me. I loved it. I watched it 4 times in the theater. Twice I paid, and 2 of those times I sneaked in for a second time. I'm a criminal. I watched it on Plex. I watched it on Netflix. And I watched it when I got the Blu-ray. I showed it to my ex-fiance. Didn't I? Yeah, I think, yeah, I did. I showed her a lot of movies. She was into Marvel too. But damn, I love Thor Ragnarok. And it was playing the other day at my work. The same day I had earlier remarked to Tim Tolbert, I think I'd watch it again as either a warm-up or an after, nightcap after Love and Thunder. Excuse me. I have pretty much eliminated soda from my diet, except occasionally diet soda on kind of weekends today. So get to the point, Covert. I loved Ragnarok. I thought it was endlessly inventive. I thought the production design was incredible. It drew heavily on Jack Kirby. It was the very first MCU movie to have a production design and costume design that did draw heavily on Jack Kirby. That wasn't revisionism of his work. Sadly, the Eternals was revisionism. I was counting on that to be the continuation of Waititi's statement. Black Panther was to an extent. There's a good bit of Kirby visually in Black Panther. And that I love. Because Jack Kirby created Black Panther. And I'm not going to argue with people like Frank, whatever his name is, that Stan Lee created Black Panther. I just don't buy it. I don't buy it for a single minute. I believe Stan Lee wrote some dialogue for his first appearances as Fantastic Four. And then that was it. Because Roy Thomas wrote him in the Avengers and developed him quite a bit. Kirby didn't seem to mind. And then Don McGregor took over and really crafted his world, took it world building of Wakanda to another level. Then there's later modern iterations, and you take all that together, and that's what you kind of have in the film Black Panther, which is, really still, to me, a landmark film for a lot of reasons, beyond being a Marvel and MCU fan. But with Ragnarok, it was the beginning, and Black Panther carried it on. Eternals dropped the ball so badly, but Waititi picked it up, man. He took it to the fucking goal line to flog the metaphor to its logical death. And, I kind of feel as though as the Love and Thunder was, Love and Thunder brings together all of his concerns into one film. The things that are emblematic of Waititi, but also emblematic of Waititi specifically, his vision of Thor and his way of translating the Marvel comics that he's obviously an absolute authority on inside out. So what are these concerns? Well, Kirby, obviously visually Kirby, production design, costumes, characters take of Kirby's scenarios, shots, poses of the characters. Quite a few Kirby lifts. There's quite a few shots in Love and Thunder that are Kirby lifts from Thor panels, more than in Ragnarok. Because in Ragnarok he's also incorporating Hulk, also a Kirby character, but Hulk never really had a Kirby flavor. Hulk didn't feel like his other more science fiction / mythological characters. Hulk had his own thing, and Kirby didn't stick around long on Hulk. A lot of people played in the Hulk sandbox. Of course, Stan Lee, but notably Steve Ditko is arguably who created the blueprint for the popular Hulk that persisted for years until Peter David again redefined the character, created a new emblematic Hulk, and then Bruce Jones did the same. And Marvel basically threw out all their work. Said, fuck this. We'll take little pieces of it, cannibalize it. And that's what they did. They cannibalized it, but, they didn't digest it. They just chewed it up and regurgitated it onto the page. And that's what we're left of the Hulk and Banner in Marvel. And there's not going to be something like the graphic novel Banner by Brian Azzarello and the incredible Richard Corbin. There will not come something like that again. Or Return of the Monster by Bruce Jones, John Romita Jr., Lee Weeks, and onwards into Mike Deodato's finest artwork. But that's the Hulk. So Thor, Waititi was really using the Thor mythology. I mean, he was actually using other Marvel mythology, like I said, Hulk's, and of course the Grandmaster was not a character made up for Hulk. It was a Roy Thomas character made up for the Avengers. But he was reinvented, and he only looked kind of like the character, but the Grandmaster was kind of a jackass, very manipulative, of course. That's part of his whole thing. But making it an absurdist, eccentric, flamboyant character under Goldblum was really kind of an inspired choice, I think. I know at first I was like, but then I'm like, got to start thinking outside of the box. Got to. We all have to, man. The box is killing us. It's like closing in on us. Like those old movies where the walls start to close in on the characters. Or worse yet, the walls closing in on you with spikes. Some kind of cliffhanger, man. We are up to the cliffhanger. How if we get out of this fucking box? And I'm talking about the world, society, the very fabric of our existence. I'm not talking about movies. But I do believe art is part of the way we're going to break the box. And as far as using that cliche of thinking outside the box, applying it to Thor, Love and Thunder, he fucking destroyed the box. So like I said, his concerns are Kirby, the look of Kirby, the flavor, the characters of Kirby. Other Marvel iconic characters, just as he used Grandmaster in Ragnarok, and this one he uses Eternity. Of all characters, it was a Doctor Strange character created by Steve Ditko and who hasn't ever interacted with Doctor Strange. Waititi brought him into the MCU. So wonderful. So very short glimpses, but they're visually powerful. And to people who grew up on those comics, they are iconic. They're like in your collective consciousness. They're stirring our collective consciousness. The people, who grew up with this stuff, people who were either older than me, who grew up with the Lee Kirby Ditko in the 60s, to people like, and a little into the 70s, people like me who started in the early 70s on this shit and, was really a fanatic until the mid 80s of Marvel. And those are two powerful eras. So people in, that spans like a generation age wise. We'll just say we'll say people 40 to 60. How about that? 35 to 60. 35 to 60. 35 to 65? Somewhere in there. There's a lot of people that can hold this shit in their minds and experience it at a very tender young age. And it inspires them. It inspires so many of them to become artists and writers, including me. And it's a powerful experience. So I think that's part of Waititi's thing is he's taking the Kirby experience, he's taking bits and pieces of the Marvel tapestry, the Marvel Comics tapestry, feeding it in there. And then he's also riffing off the time he grew up. Now, I'm not sure how old he is. I know he's younger than me. But there's 80s rock in this movie, 80s metal. And this is what's wild is, in the last movie, there's a gaudiness. There's all the visual stylists working in the MCU were afraid to embrace gaudiness and primary colors. And I understand why. I'm totally down with toning down Daredevil's red and the X-Men wearing black leather. Fine, I get it. A lot of it has to do with how it looks when it's photographed, because this is a photographic medium, a cinematographic medium, visual. So gaudiness has to be done just right. Spectacle has to be done just right. And somehow Waititi hit it. Because Kirby stuff is spectacle. Kirby stuff is primary colors, usually. And, it's myth. It's mythology. He took existing mythology and he created an American mythology that will last forever, for as long as humanity lasts. Which may not be that long the rate we're going now. Kirby will die with us. And the thing is, that's what he's doing. And with that gaudiness, that outrageousness, that camp edge in it, there are other things from the era that this writer grew up with that are also emblematic. And obviously metal music is. And the stereotype of Thor as being a long-haired dude. And Thor early on never had a beard. He wasn't that kind of character. He always wore his helmet. But there was a period, when Walt Simonson took over and hella fucked up his face and there was a curse on him. And he wore the mask, which Jane Foster ends up wearing later. And he grew a beard. And he kept the beard for a long time. And then there was a period where he didn't wear the helmet much and he had the beard. Those are later iterations of Thor. We're talking about early 1990s. There was a period where Warren Ellis wrote a good run with Mike Deodato art. There was a period where Roy Thomas wrote it again, and they reconciled all this Jane Foster, Don Blake, Dr. Kincaid stuff. That was a good period for Thor, because after Simonson's on Thor twice, and that's another thing people don't realize. I'm going to wrap up this video. Part 2, I'm going to talk a lot about Simonson and what of his work is in this movie. But let me just finish up real quick by saying the thing that Waititi hooked on, besides some of the humor and Tales of Topographic Oceans, maybe, references, like I said, was metal. So Guns N' Roses and arrangements of their material and their album Appetite for Destruction become important parts of the movie and definitely the trailer. And the end credits, Dio, A Rainbow in the Dark, from his first album, Holy Diver. And think about the lyrics and think about rainbows, the Rainbow Bridge. Dio means God. I mean, to me, it gets pretty deep. Okay, I'll be back with more of it either later today or tomorrow. Love you guys.